In the summer of 2009, a man received a phone call that would change his life forever. The key had handed back the keys, walked away from the most valuable music catalog on the planet, and spent years rebuilding a career that didn't depend on one client's unpredictable decisions. And then that client died. Within hours, John Branca was back, not as a mourner, not as a former colleague paying his respects. He was back as the executor of the estate, a position that would give him control over a fortune that Michael Jackson himself had never fully trusted him to manage while he was alive. For years, the story told about John Branca was simple: loyal attorney, trusted advisor, the man who helped Michael Jackson build one of the greatest financial empires in music history. And that story isn't wrong. It's just incomplete, because the full story includes the firings, the power struggles, the disputed contracts, the question of who really holds the keys to Michael Jackson's legacy, and whether that's the person Michael would have chosen. The headlines told one version of events. The documents tell another. Ask the average Michael Jackson fan about John Branca, and you'll get one of two answers. Some will tell you he's a hero, the architect behind the Sony ATV catalog acquisition, the man who helped Michael Jackson secure the most valuable music publishing deal in history, a deal that made him richer than most musicians ever dreamed of becoming. The steady legal hand behind decades of contracts, negotiations, and business moves that defined the business of pop music. Others will tell you he's a villain, the executor who profited from a client who couldn't profit for himself, the man who turned Michael Jackson's death into an industry. The person at the center of a power structure that some fans believe actively works against Michael's own wishes and legacy. But here's what most people in either camp don't fully understand. Both versions contain pieces of the truth. John Branca is not a simple character. He's not a loyal servant. He's not a calculated predator. He is something far more interesting and far more revealing about how the entertainment industry actually works. He is a man who built a relationship with the most famous person on earth, lost that relationship multiple times, and ultimately outlasted the person he served to gain control of everything that person left behind. That's not a fairy tale. That's not a conspiracy. That's a story about power, loyalty, and what happens when extraordinary wealth outlives the person who created it. John Branca first became Michael Jackson's attorney in 1980. Michael was 21 years old. He had already spent most of his life performing, but he had not yet spent much of it making decisions about money, contracts, or the architecture of a career. That kind of thinking was new territory, and he needed people around him who understood it. Branca understood it. He came from a world of entertainment law where knowing how to negotiate was the most valuable skill you could offer. He had worked with some of the biggest names in the industry. He understood publishing rights, royalty structures, licensing deals, and the long game of building a catalog rather than simply collecting checks. What followed in the early 1980s was one of the most productive attorney-client relationships in music history. Branca helped Michael negotiate his deal for the Thriller album. He helped structure the terms that would eventually make Michael one of the highest-paid artists in the world. And then he did something that would define both of their legacies forever. In 1985, he helped Michael Jackson purchase ATV Music Publishing for approximately $47 million. ATV was not just a catalog. It contained the publishing rights to over 250 Beatles songs, a collection so valuable, so culturally significant, that Paul McCartney himself had wanted it and failed to secure it. Michael got it. That single acquisition changed everything. It made Michael Jackson one of the most powerful figures not just in music performance, but in music ownership. And it was Branca who structured the deal. For several years after that, the partnership seemed almost ideal. Branca was building something. Michael was benefiting from it. The trust between them, or at least the appearance of trust, held together. But that wasn't the whole story. In 1990, Michael Jackson fired John Branca. The reason given publicly was vague. Something about wanting to restructure his team and bring in new management. But those who followed the business closely understood what was really happening. Michael was uncomfortable. He was uncomfortable with the complexity of his own financial situation. He was uncomfortable with how much power any single advisor had accumulated around his affairs. And there were concerns, some documented, some discussed only in private, about whether the people managing his business were managing it in his best interest or in theirs. Branca was not accused of wrongdoing at the time, but he was removed, and that removal tells you something important. Michael Jackson, despite his reputation for being surrounded by yes-men and manipulated by advisors, was capable of exercising judgment about the people around him. He made the call. He ended the relationship. Branca moved on. He continued building his career, working with other clients, maintaining his position as one of the most respected entertainment attorneys in Los Angeles. Life continued, and then, roughly a decade later, Michael brought him back. The second phase of their relationship spanned the late 1990s into the mid-2000s. It was a more complicated era. Michael was dealing with legal pressures, shifting public perception, and the mounting financial weight of the Neverland Ranch, and a lifestyle that was costing more than it was earning. Branca was back in the center of it, negotiating, advising, managing, and then Michael fired him again. The second termination came in 2003. This time, the context was more charged. Michael was in the middle of one of the most intense periods of public scrutiny of his life. The Martin Bashir documentary had just aired. The accusations that would lead to the 2005 criminal trial were forming on the horizon. Everything around Michael Jackson felt unstable. He sent a letter. The letter terminated John Branca's services, effective immediately. The letter also raised questions, not accusations, but questions about billing practices, about the structure of compensation, about whether certain arrangements had served Michael's interests as clearly as they should have. Branca denied any wrongdoing. He maintained that his work had been conducted professionally and in Michael's best interest throughout their relationship. And to be fair to him, the specific concerns raised in that letter were never proven in any legal proceeding, but the letter existed. Michael Jackson, with his own signature, had ended the relationship a second time and had chosen language that expressed something beyond a routine management restructuring. Few people in the general public knew this detail at the time. The story of Branca's relationship with Michael was largely told as a smooth partnership with a few interruptions. The internal friction was not the headline. What happened next, in 2009, changed everything. Michael Jackson died on June 25, 2009. Within days, a will was located. It was dated July 7, 2002, a period when John Branca was, in fact, still working with Michael Jackson. The will named Branca and a music executive named John McClain as co-executors of the estate. The controversy began almost immediately. Some members of Michael's family, including his mother, Katherine Jackson, questioned the validity of the will. They raised concerns about whether Michael had truly signed it under the circumstances described, whether it reflected his actual wishes, and whether the date on the document aligned with where Michael claimed to have been on that day. These challenges were heard in probate court, and the court ultimately upheld the will. But the questions didn't disappear. They settled into the background, resurfacing periodically in interviews, legal filings, and the kind of social media debates that follow any major celebrity estate dispute. What was not disputed was the outcome. John Branca became co-executor of the Michael Jackson estate. The man who had been fired twice, whose relationship with his most famous client had ended in writing before that client died, was now legally responsible for managing everything that client left behind. The estate grew rapidly. The deals that followed, the MyJack music catalog, the Sony ATV merger, the Las Vegas residency productions, the MJ Broadway musical, and eventually the Michael Jackson biopic, transformed the estate into one of the highest-earning celebrity estates in history, generating hundreds of millions of dollars annually. Branca received a fee for this work, a significant one. The exact figures have been the subject of ongoing scrutiny, and through all of it, the deals, the earnings, the disputes, one question kept quietly circulating among those who followed the story closely. Was this the outcome Michael Jackson would have wanted? In 2025, the Michael Jackson biopic entered production with a detail that, once you notice it, is difficult to look away from. Miles Teller was cast to play John Branca in the film, not Michael Jackson. Not one of the musicians or collaborators who shaped Michael's career, not even one of the adversaries. The film included as a significant enough character to warrant a well-known actor, the attorney who managed Michael's business affairs, and John Branca produced the film. Let that arrangement settle for a moment. The man who controlled Michael Jackson's estate, and thus had authority over who could tell Michael's story and how, was also a character in the story being told. And he was producing it. This is not a small detail buried in the credits. The Michael Jackson biopic is not an independent film. It is not the product of journalists or historians working at arm's length from the people involved. It is an estate-authorized production, developed with the full cooperation and active involvement of the people who now manage Michael's business, his image, and his name. The estate has consistently defended its creative involvement as necessary to ensure accuracy and protect Michael's legacy. And there is a case to be made for that position. An estate-endorsed film might be more likely to have access to real footage, real documents, and real context than an unauthorized production working around legal restrictions. But there is also a case to be made for the opposing view, when the subject of a documentary and the producer of a documentary are the same entity. The result is not a documentary. It is a portrait sitting. Who decides which version of Michael Jackson's story gets told? Who decides what gets emphasized and what gets left on the floor of the editing room? Who decides how the relationship between Michael and his estate appears on screen, and whether the complications in that relationship, the firings, the letters, the distance Michael tried to create in his final years, make it into the final cut? Who benefits from the narrative that emerges? These are not small questions. They are the questions that define how history gets written and who controls it. Here is what makes the John Branca story more than just an estate dispute or a Hollywood conflict of interest story. It is a story about a structural reality of the entertainment industry that almost never gets examined directly. When a major artist is alive, they have final say. They can fire people, they can hire people, they can change their will, change their team, change their mind. Michael Jackson exercised that power at least twice with Branca alone. When a major artist dies, that power transfers. It transfers to executors, estate administrators, trustees, and the courts that oversee them. And the people positioned to receive that transfer are often the very people who were closest to the artist's business in the years before death. Regardless of how complicated that relationship had become, it is not necessarily corruption. It is not necessarily betrayal. It is, more precisely, a gap between what an artist might have wanted and what the legal structures around their death actually produce. This gap is not unique to Michael Jackson. It has appeared in the estates of other major artists. Disputes over the estates of Prince, Amy Winehouse, and Aretha Franklin all revealed similar tensions between what artists expressed in life and what legal documents determined after death. But the scale of Michael Jackson's estate and the intensity of public interest in his story makes the gap more visible here than almost anywhere else. Michael Jackson spent years worrying about this gap. He expressed concern in private conversations, in interviews, in the 2003 letter terminating Branca about whether the people around him were truly serving his vision or their own interests. The documents exist. The firings happened. The concerns were real. And then he died. And the people he had fired were back. Whether that outcome was appropriate or inevitable or something else entirely, that depends on questions that courts have answered one way, and some members of Michael's family have answered another. What's harder to dispute is that the story is more complicated than the version most people have heard. Set aside the speculation, set aside the family challenges and the fan forums and the social media arguments. What does the documented record actually show? It shows that John Branca helped Michael Jackson make one of the most strategically brilliant acquisitions in music history. That is not in dispute. The ATV catalog purchase was a masterclass in long-term value creation, and Branca's role in it was central. It shows that Michael Jackson terminated Branca's services twice. The letters exist. The circumstances around each termination involved some level of concern about the management of Michael's affairs, concerns that were expressed in writing by Michael himself. It shows that the will naming Branca as executor was dated during a period when their relationship was active, but was located and presented after Michael's death, at a time when Michael could no longer confirm, modify, or contest it. It shows that the estate under Branca's management has generated extraordinary revenue that has benefited Michael's children and mother as the primary beneficiaries, alongside the professional fees of those managing it. It shows that the biopic, the most significant new piece of Michael Jackson's storytelling in a generation, was produced by an entity that Branca controls, with a narrative framework that the estate shaped. None of those facts individually constitute evidence of wrongdoing. Together, they constitute a A picture of how power works around celebrity, around death, and around the stories we tell about both. In 1985, Michael Jackson made a phone call and bought the rights to 250 Beatles songs. It was one of the most audacious business moves in the history of popular music. He made that call with John Branca's help. 24 years later, Michael Jackson died, and John Branca was back, not as a former attorney, not as a mourner, but as the legal steward of everything Michael had built and everything Michael had become. The firings didn't matter. The letters didn't matter. The concerns that Michael had expressed in writing, the exits that he had engineered, the distance he had tried to create, none of it altered what the will said or what the court decided. Now a film is being made. Miles Teller plays John Branca on screen. The real Branca produced the film, and the man the film was made about fired Branca at least twice while he was alive. Whether that's justice or irony, loyalty or control, protection of a legacy or the final chapter of a complicated relationship, that's not for any single voice to decide. But the story, as most people know it, is not the whole story. The truth is rarely as simple as the headlines make it seem. And when it comes to Michael Jackson, the most misunderstood figure in the history of popular music, that has never been more true than it is right now.